Hey, great day, y'all. So I am back talking about hot takes as it relates to clinical supervision and, of course, us doing our due diligence as supervisors and not doing the bare minimum, okay? We are paying it forward for clinical supervisees to enter into the mental health field. We want to make sure that they're equipped not just with confidence, but also clarity related to what is their area of expertise, where do they shine the most, and more importantly, can we prepare them to help them pass the licensing exam? And so if this is your first time tuning in, my name is Dr. TK. I am a licensed clinical psychologist, therapist, business mentor, but I've had a round robin of different types of opportunities and positions across my 2 decades in the mental health field. And one of them was a clinical supervisor for over a decade and a half. And so if you have not listened to or watched part 1, I would highly recommend it. It sets the context for what I'm going to be talking about in storytelling time in this particular part 2. And just to give you a Cliff Notes version is I interviewed for a position. I was introduced to the previous supervisor and realized that I knew the supervisor who I would pretty much be taking their place. I did recognize that there were some red flags as it relates to quote unquote bare minimum for the supervisees. And I knew that there may be a little bit of a transition for those clinicians, those supervisees to get accustomed to another way of participating in supervision. But my welcoming was pretty good and I was very surprised. I did not get a lot of pushback. So now let's move into part 2. And again, I'll interweave the story. Okay. So when you think about giving supervision, you really want to think about it as a relationship very similar that you have in the therapeutic space with a therapy client. Think about it. When you get a new client, you typically might do some form of a consultation. You do a thorough intake that may take 1, 2, 3 weeks, depending on what they're coming to therapy for. You collaboratively together set a treatment plan, and then you start conducting treatment, and then you keep tabs on progress, also known as clinical documentation, to make sure that what you are doing in therapy aligns with what their presenting problem is and the treatment plan you put together, right? That is what's known as a short version of the clinical loop. Okay, so I'm gonna come back to that in a moment, but the reason why I bring up the importance of the relationship is that you should be putting as much effort as you do in therapy with clients as you do with future supervisees. So I'm gonna break this down into phases, but in the beginning, think about it as the first day of care, right? So when you're introducing yourself to a group of supervisee or a group of them at a time, you want to get to know them. You want to be a little bit of an open book and let them know where have you worked as well. I was always taught when I was a professor is that you always want to embed cultural competency and professional development in all of your classrooms and clinical classrooms so that those students can know what is possible. So when you're coming into an existing agency and you're doing supervision, I would highly recommend warm handoffs, which is what I talked about in part 1. Again, these individuals can get to know you. They can tell you a little bit about the supervisees, very similar to if you have been a therapist and you go into an agency and they say you've inherited a caseload. You're like, okay, is there some type of transitional notes or do I need to read through every single progress note, right? So let's go into the phases of abundant clinical supervision. Okay, not bare minimum. So phase 1 is relationship building. So I want you to imagine that this is your first week. And this is pretty much what I did. You want to focus intentionally on getting to know them. So for example, what are they going to school for? Because not everybody went to school for the same thing. How far are they from taking the licensing exam, either, exam part 1, or if in the state they have an exam part 2. You also want to gain an understanding of what kind of clients are on their caseloads, especially if this agency gives them a diversification of children, adolescents, adults, families, groups, and all the things. And then you may want to also have an individual conversation with them because we never want to assume that someone's communication style is the same individually that it is in a group. And you want to talk to them about their confidence levels. What are areas that they're very aware of that needs more work? Even if it's something simple like I need to get better at decision tree and diagnosing. Now, diagnosing is pretty big, But what I mean by simple is it's not the whole therapeutic process, right? They understood from a textbook knowledge space how to do family therapy and different theoretical orientations. But when it comes down to finding the diagnoses for the identified patient or the identified client, they may have a more, difficult time. I would also encourage you to get to know where did they work at previously, not just regular outside of mental health jobs, but also, and that's important, but also what kind of other agencies did they collect hours in? Now, you never want to assume that just because someone is older, seasoned in the field, it's their second career, or maybe this is their second degree in licensure. You never want to assume that you don't need to train them. And I think that's a part of the mentality of what I've seen as the bare minimum, like, oh, this person is 45, 50, 60 years of age. They have life experience. They went to school. They went and worked for this government agency with their last practicum or internship. They interviewed well. They're fine. They were fine at those agencies, but I'm very sure if we were talking about quality of care, those agencies took their time and they trained those individuals to work in their agency, to learn how to do intakes in their agency, how to do documentation in their agency, okay? So all of this relationship and rapport building is going to understand where they are in the licensing process. It will also help you understand where they are in the case conceptualization process, because not everybody has been equipped the same based on either where they went to school or their track history with internships. And then also maybe even what they're interested in post licensure so that you could embed professional development. So are these individuals are interested in, going to get a 9-to-5 government county job? Do they want to work in correctional facilities, nonprofits? Do they want to have a solo practice? Maybe do they even want to be a clinical supervisor one day? Because if you know that this is the group's goals, then you can intertwine this throughout a year or more, depending on their rotation, to have like bonus workshops or trainings because, they're caught up with everything else. And so you do want to talk about their goals, their background, and where they're at. And I would do that in at minimum week 1 to set the tone for week 2. You also want to let them know, which is what I did. I showed up and I said, this is the structure of what's going to start happening next week in clinical supervision. So structure includes these things, but not limited to. Everybody is expected to stay for the full 2 hours. Now, the reason I said that was because some people thought that they could just leave, 30 minutes into supervision because they scheduled a client. There will be no clients scheduled within the supervision 2 hours. Depending on where you are in terms of licensure and maybe even school requirements or board requirements, some of you will be required to come an hour earlier to meet with me for individual supervision, because some boards require that they have both individual and group supervision for the amount of clients that they are seeing. And sometimes I may just request that we figure out a time and a day to meet before the group, because especially if they are dealing with court mandated individuals, difficult cases, sometimes we can't clearly get to the nitty gritty in group supervision. And so I really set the tone for what they were to expect when they came into supervision, because again, I don't like to go into relationships with a whole lot of assumptions. So I would cover that all in phase 1, the getting to know you and setting basic structure. Now in phase 2, I'm going to call this bringing in structure and training. Okay. So based on the phases, I hope you can also see that I am addressing what a lot of supervisors do not do. May I dare say that? We don't do structure. We do, let me hear you talk. Let me see your progress notes. I will sign them. And that is it. And one of the main issues is potentially due to you being a contractual supervisor, which means that no one is technically overseeing you. But Big Brother is. And so is your licensing board. So at all costs protect it, because I don't know about you, I'm not losing my license for nobody, no agency. And being a clinical supervisor comes with a certain level of liability. So let's move into phase 2. So let me introduce to you in a slower pace the clinical loop. I address this in the very beginning so that they can see how all of the sections of understanding a case based on the questions that I'm also going to bring into supervision are connected together, not compartmentalized, right? So let's just say if you are seeing a client, the first phase you're going to do outside of a consultation is the intake. Now, like I said earlier, the intake can take a couple of sessions, right? Depending on the client and their presenting problems, heavy trauma, complex trauma, et cetera. So you're going to do the intake session. And the point of that is to gather as much thorough, in-depth background information you can collect. If you see children, you need to pretty much talk to everybody who breathes on the kid. I'm talking about not just biological parents or caregivers like grandparents, but if this kid is hanging out with somebody half of the week like a grandparent and you only talk to the mother and father or one or the other, you're missing a piece. If you are working with a kid who has a blended family, just don't talk to the biological parent in which they are the ones that are bringing the kid to, therapy, right? So we want to teach interns and associates this. You want to do a thorough intake. Now that you have enough information, then you're going to move to step 2 in the clinical loop, which is a diagnosis. The diagnosis is connected to the evidence that you collected in the intake. Then in part or phase 3 of the clinical loop is the collaborative treatment plan. It's collaborative on purpose. You should not just be giving clients a treatment plan. And I'm going to talk to you as though you were the supervisee. That's why I'm saying you. Okay. So after you develop collaboratively the treatment plan and they sign off on it or the caregiver sign off on it, then you actually start the treatment. That is the 4th step. Then in the 5th, you have the progress notes. The progress notes should be the treatment plan based on what they said. And then your therapeutic techniques should be based on the diagnoses and the treatment plan of what they said. Everything is interconnected. You should technically be able to get a grade of A through F based on all of these components. Now, after you do the progress notes, then clearly you have the maintenance of the client and then they graduate from services. So I took my time, literally a full week, training the supervisees if it took 2 hours so that they can ask questions on the clinical loop. I gave them a handout on the clinical loop. And then I also explained to them that when we start doing case studies, starting in about 2 weeks, you will be expected to follow the clinical loop when I am looking at progress notes. Therefore, if I have a question about how they wrote a progress note, maybe something that's missing, maybe they wrote too much in a progress note, because yes, that's a thing, then they will know where it's coming from. Because I don't want to come off as a cold, just mark your paper up like a college professor in red ink. Like, no, I want you to know where this structured positive feedback so that you can be a better clinician moving forward past licensure when you do documentation. Okay. So I introduced the clinical loop. I'll also introduce case conceptualization. So this is where you want to get very creative. I would say look back to how you learned how to do a very in-depth case conceptualization that helped you do very well in your clinical work right now or prepare for the exam. So most of us have this stuff in folders from our associate, practicum, postdoc, etc. So I just went back to I keep all my stuff in folders. I went back to all of my folders. I went back to my memory and I compiled it all. And I looked at what components are important for the clinicians to be able to easily collect this information in the clinical loop. And I used my experience working in the correctional facility because they were under the umbrella of Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, which has very thorough 8-page for adults and 15-page intakes for children. Okay. And so I used that and then I took it a step further. This is key. I just did not say you're expected to do this case conceptualization, sign up, good luck. No. Let me show you an example case following through on this case conceptualization. I gave them a real case and I just removed all identifying demographic. By far, anytime I do this type of training on intake, clinical loop, and what does a case conceptualization look like with all the pieces of the clinical loop, I get praises. I'm going to toot my own horn because people say, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And you make it so simple because all you're doing is following an outline. Okay. So that is all in phase 2. And that may be, again, 1 to 2 supervision sessions because in phase 3 is now it's time to sign up for case conceptualization. So we don't spend the whole 2 hours doing case conceptualization. Out of the 2 hours, 1 hour will be dedicated to the structure that I gave them in the beginning around what does supervision look like. I have a particular layout with how I can identify if a case is like a high priority, you want to share a win, which I highly encourage, and or maybe something that's in the middle. But ultimately, those who said that they have like a high priority case, we're going to do a round robin, one, high priority at a time. So that it's just not one person supervision, and we're going to work through it. So we may say we're going to do general Q&A in the beginning because I want to spend the second half, if not more time, on the case conceptualization. So in phase 3 with the case conceptualization, now it's time for them to be accountable and to sign up. So if let's just say today is December 1st, I may not start, if we're running into the holidays, I may not start the case conceptualization sign up until January 10th, whatever the first week we're back for supervision outside of the holiday break. Now, I want them to start being responsible. So I let them know, hey, if you know that your school is out for this week, therefore you're not going to be seeing clients, because that may be the case for some people, don't sign up during the week that you know you're not going to be here. Also, don't wait and just pass around the paper, because if we only have one spot left, you get whatever is left over. So I'm teaching them responsibly, like assert yourself and go after what you want. So they sign up. I teach them how to do a case conceptualization. And then I also help them tie in that this is not just looked at as more work. I'm not making you do busy work. I'm helping you prepare for the exam. I'm also helping you prepare for job interviews, and or if you are in a state that does things old school and they have an oral interview. I don't even know if they do that anymore. But at the end of the day, the last thing you want is to go to a job interview, and that will be in another part of this series. I'll tell y'all what happened. But you don't want to go to an interview and be ill prepared. And then unfortunately, it is reflected on not just the student, but the supervisors, because again, that is bare minimum. So I want them to be able to tie in not just theory and theoretical orientation talk, but I want you to be able to talk about your cases in regular English. By all means, you have to understand the psycho jargon. You write it up, and they got to write it up and give us copies. You write it up in psycho jargon, but you have to be able to talk to us in a regular language. Okay. If that makes sense. All right. Now, phase 4 is moving into the scheduling and accountability. Again, they're going to plug themselves into the case conceptualization, and then we're actually going to start the process. Now, I do typically 2 rounds of case conceptualization. So the first round is just the general case conceptualization, and then they have to lead it in with a question. What is one question that you want us to pay attention to as you are presenting the case? Now, because we do handouts, I collect the handouts at the end and I shred all of them, because I don't want anybody taking anybody's cases home, and they are instructed to take out any general, demographic information. So let's just say if I had these students for a year, the second half of the year, because now they've been accustomed, they hear other people do case conceptualizations. Now what I'm going to do, because most clinicians are not taught how to videotape, audio tape, or do process notes so that we can really see what is really happening in the therapy session. Because to me, that is the liability part, like that somebody can say that they did one thing in supervision, like in the therapy session, but they did not. So I do process notes because I know most therapists have never been trained. I did a whole internship in my pre-doc for object relations therapy. While everybody may not agree and or do psychodynamic work, I do believe, especially when you work with individuals who have in-depth traumatic histories, it is very good to understand them from a perspective of how did you become the person that you are today, right? Not just client-centered, CBT, EMDR. How did you become the person that I'm sitting across from today? And understanding psychodynamic, especially object relations, which means that we're looking at the relationships they had with caregivers and et cetera. It really helps you understand people in relationships and all these other things. So I taught them the premises of object relations. I didn't go that deep. And ultimately in the second round, I want them to add a process note. And what they've recognized is that what they write and what they remember after their session is not what's in that process note. And pretty much everybody who's done a process note with me realizes that they missed a lot of things in the session, because sometimes they're so focused on taking notes, they're so focused on what diagnoses and all those things that they're not even fully being present with the person in session. Now, I'm not saying you got to do all these parts, but I just wanted to give you a clear picture of how your girl don't do bare minimum. You are going to be a highly qualified mental health provider that will pass the exam, because you're not going to leave any supervisory site that I'm at and all I did was sign progress notes, okay? Now, again, I tie this into going to interviews, working at different placements, and ultimately being a better therapist even for the clients that you're currently serving, okay? So let me wrap up now that I've given you my 4 phases of how I onboard myself in clinical supervision. Is you want to take on the mindset of these are individuals that are going to be in the future of the mental health field. These are individuals that are going to see our children's children if somebody needs counseling. These are going to be individuals that go get licensed and they are supposed to be taking care of other people, and you represent your field because you're licensed as well. So why would you sign up to do the bare minimum for clinical supervision, knowing that they are our future, literally like our kids, okay? So I really hope that by me walking through my onboarding process for clinical supervision gave you a better and in-depth understanding of maybe even some things that you have not done if you do supervise and you are interested in. And I would like you to go down to the comment section of this video, and I want you to write out what is one thing that I talked about in the 4 phases that you would like to try if you are already conducting supervision. And if you are a student, what is something that you would love to learn from other supervisors so that they can see that as well, because we have different groups of people, consuming this type of educational content, okay? Now, if you are a licensed provider and you're like, gosh, I really love the way that Dr. TK breaks this down. I want her whole system. I want her to coach me through developing my own clinical supervision curriculum. In addition to, yes, making sure that my current business and clinical practice is up and running and up to par. Maybe I want to use my expertise to, dibble and dabble into speaking 2 to 3 times a year, but I really want to pay it forward, and I want to do it from a space of peace and not pressure in terms of showing up for clinical supervisees as a contracted clinical supervisor. If that is you, I want you to go down to the show notes. I want you to take a look at the application for our Therapist Scale Academy. This is a community that we meet with throughout the month and once a month as a mini mastermind virtually, where we help them build out, give them a step-by-step clinical supervision curriculum, copy and paste, just personalize it to your liking. And we help you build out your own clinical supervisory program, not group practice. That is something different. We also, of course, help you make sure that you are operating in your genius zone in your solo private practice, if that's something that you're interested in. In addition to, we also talk about speaking and showing up as an expert trainer, as a mental health provider, because all of these are intertwined that you can actually do in your solo practice. And so if that is you and you would like to learn more about our Therapist Scale Academy, go to the description box, check out our application, and subscribe to the channel, like this video, and make sure y'all come back so that we can get in the nitty-gritty of, some things that happened beyond the clinical supervision hour that, help the girl go ahead and exit out of the situation. All right. I will talk to y'all in the next one. Bye.